Hello, welcome Texas. Greetings from Charleston, South Carolina. I am Carrie Campbell, the National Outreach Director for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and it is a great pleasure to be with you here today. We were supposed to be meeting in person back in March, and unfortunately, circumstances as they are, we had to change that to this virtual platform, but it's so great that we're still able to connect in this way. We are really meeting at a time with very heavy hearts and turmoil in our country for so many people who are addressing health issues and economic issues and social injustice crises. And as of this morning, a natural disaster happening just in your neck of the woods in Texas and in Florida. And the entire USGLC family really wants to say, we hope that you, your family, and your loved ones are all staying safe at this time. But even in the midst of all of that, we are being joined by over 150 people from Texas, around the state, and in the 32nd Congressional District, because we want to have this important conversation about America's global leadership and why leading globally matters locally. And we're seeing this play out right in front of our eyes right now. So this is a great conversation, timely to have this conversation, and thrilled that we will be joined by Congressman Colin Allred, who's back in our Zoom room at the moment, and I'll bring him out in a few minutes. But as USGLC is celebrating our 25th anniversary, I know that there are some new faces that are joining us today. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, who we are and what we do. We are over 500 American businesses and humanitarian organizations alongside business leaders, faith leaders, military leaders, academic leaders, and so much more, and community leaders all around the country. We have a bipartisan National Advisory Council chaired by Secretary Colin Powell, and it's made up of the nation's top experts on national security and foreign policy, and includes almost every former living Secretary of State. Additionally, we have our National Security Advisory Council, over 200 retired generals and flag officers, co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Anthony Zinni. And serving alongside them in their continuation of service are 30,000 veterans for Smart Power from all across the country, who are part of this initiative because they really believe in strengthening America's civilian tools of national security. And what brings this broad, diverse coalition together is our understanding and our firm belief that we are living in an interconnected world and getting more interconnected every day, and that America needs to be engaged globally so that we can advance our interest here at home. We talk about this tiny 1% of the US federal budget called the International Affairs budget. It's the most cost-effective and powerful investment that America can make. And you may have heard it called the foreign affairs budget or the foreign aid budget, but it is really so much more than that. It's our embassies and our diplomats all around the globe and support for our key allies. It's our efforts to tackle global health threats, such as the current one the pandemic we're living in, our ability to respond to humanitarian disasters all around the globe, impacts of climate change, and to address and tackle the root causes of terrorism. It's our work that combats corruption, supports and promotes the rule of law, and advances democracy and universal rights and freedoms for everyone. And it's our programs that open up new markets for American goods and services, the public-private partnerships that offer a hand up, not a handout, to millions around the globe. It's effective, it's accountable, it's transparent, it's transformative, and it works for me and you, the American people. So we host forums like this all around the country. And what we found is something very interesting, that across political ideologies and across state lines, Americans just like you want to be engaged. So tragically, we are seeing COVID-19 underscore the importance of being engaged and committed to this fight. And we're so fortunate today to be joined by an expert in Congress to help us think through these issues and talk through these issues. And so with that, I would like to bring on our special guest, someone you all know well, your Congressman, Representative Colin Allred. Thank you for being here, Congressman. Colin Allred has been hard at work in both Washington and in Texas, addressing the challenges of COVID-19 over the past several months now, and really working to keep Texas and all Americans safe. And Congressman Allred serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he has quickly emerged as a true leader and champion on these issues in America's global leadership and support for development and diplomacy, leading on issues from strengthening our alliances to tackling the migration crisis on the border. So Congressman, we are thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome. So let me just start off with an easy question. How are you and how's your family?
Well, thank you, Carrie. Thanks for having me. I love groups like USGLC. This is a time for us to talk about global leadership and the requirement that America be the global leader. I'm happy to get into all those things. But, you know, like most folks right now, my wife and I are taking care of our young son here at home. He's 18 months old. We're not back in daycare yet, so we're balancing work and taking care of him. And we both, my wife's an attorney, and I obviously have a busy job as well. So we're balancing that, and I think that's what a lot of American families are doing right now. It's a difficult time to be productive, but it's a critical time in many ways to be productive. So I think we've got maybe some personal insight to what's going on around the country.
Yeah, I think you're right. So many Americans are doing that same balancing routine and act. So I'd like to ask you and invite you to just sort of set the stage for us today in today's conversation. So if you would be willing to just make some opening remarks.
Sure. Well, as I said, thank you all for having me. Thank you to USGLC and the World Affairs Council, Dallas-Fort Worth, who I'm always happy to meet with. And, I think this is a really important discussion for us to be having during this time, because, it's more important than ever that we both lead here at home and take that leadership abroad. And I think that, for us, foreign policy does begin at home, and our power comes from our values here at home. And as we're facing this pandemic, so many of our values, I think, are being put to the test, and so many of our institutions are being put to the test. And from the beginning of this crisis, I've said that we need to that both for our economic health, we have to take care of the public health side. For our public health side, we have to try and keep our economy as strong as we possibly can. That these two things are intertwined, and that for us to really get over this, we need to be aggressive towards this virus, treat it like the enemy that it is, hunt it down, and try to prevent it from spreading. That's what countries like South Korea have done that have been more successful than we have with dealing with COVID-19. I pushed for funding for just that kind of a plan in the HEROES Act that we passed, I think 13 or 14 weeks ago now in the House. And it's the approach that I still hope that we will take at some point, to be much more aggressive in fighting COVID and much more aggressive in hunting it down, having rapid testing, rapid results, aggressively contact tracing, helping folks quarantine. That's how I think we'll win on the public health side and on the economic side, by giving folks confidence that they can get back involved with their economy. It's also how we can help lead the world out of this. And that's something that I really want to make sure we discuss, because this is not just an American challenge. This is a global challenge. It's something that's going to put at risk states across the globe that were already teetering. It's something that's already has created a global recession and will continue to drive some of the inequality that we know leads to extremism at times around the globe. It's going to present national security implications for us. And the United States has to be the leader in this. If we are the first ones to the vaccine, or if someone else gets there, it will still be the United States that is going to be bearing the biggest brunt in terms of distributing that and making sure that it gets around. We are the indispensable nation. We're the nation that can bring together the world around an idea. And the idea now is for us as a species to beat this virus, because we know that if it lives anywhere in the world, and if it continues to go through other countries, it will eventually come back to the United States. So it's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to do together. And we're the only country placed to lead that kind of a coalition. And so I think we have to take our place on the global stage and lead the world out of this. But we also have to lead with our values, and we have to recognize what's happening in our country right now, and both with interactions between communities of color and our police, and also the demonstrations and the election that's coming up. Global leadership is about leading with your values. When you see what's happening in Belarus, and you see the concerns there over what is basically a stolen election. And then you see efforts here at home to question the legitimacy of our election. That undermines our ability to try and push for democracy around the globe. When you have peaceful protesters who have sometimes over-aggressive crackdowns on their protests, that makes it harder for us to argue to Iran and Beijing not to do that to their protesters, whether it's in Taiwan or Hong Kong, or whether it's on the streets of Tehran. That cuts out our leg that we have to stand on when we're talking about how to treat protesters in your own country. So for us, our leadership is not just based on our power, it's based on the power of our ideas. And I think that's something that I really want to see us reassert ourselves in. And I'm happy to get into a discussion about that with you all.
Great. Well, thank you so much for setting that stage, setting the scene for us. And it's a great segue into this. So yes, we want to definitely get into these issues. So just a little logistics. We're going to start today's conversation about COVID-19 and the response of the responsibility of America addressing it, not just domestically, but also globally. Then we're going to tackle a couple of other international issues that are going on. There's one or two that we could choose from. And then we're going to turn it to the audience questions. Some of your constituents have some questions for you on these issues. So let me start off by showing you a video clip. And I just want to get your reaction to it afterwards.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
So that was 5 years ago, Bill Gates warning us that we aren't ready for the next pandemic. And what we see playing in front of our eyes is that we're certainly not. And in fact, 70% of the world is not prepared to respond to this pandemic or any other. And you sort of alluded to this in your remarks. I've heard you say that COVID-19 knows no borders and that we have to be engaged, bring everyone to the table to address this. So tell me a little bit about why does America's leadership matter in combating global health threats and responding specifically to this one, but also the necessity of being there ahead of the pandemic. And why does that matter in Texas?
Well, first of all, Melinda Gates, Bill's wife, is a Dallas native, Ursuline grad, and so we're going to take credit for him knowing that because of Dallas. But Bill was right that we were not prepared. There were plans in place, and I do want to say that there were people. I was in the Obama administration. There were people who understood that a novel virus coming out of China was very possible. We had already seen that happen with SARS, and that we would have to have a national response and have to lead the world. And there was a playbook left, and that playbook was not followed. And we have had the worst reaction really in the world here in the United States, unfortunately, in terms of the developed nations. But for Texas, the reason why this is really important that we tackle this on a global stage here is because, first of all, we are a border state, so that we are going to be impacted by what happens here in our hemisphere. We're also a state that's dependent heavily on trade, and our economy is very global. And so what happens around the globe in terms of their economies deeply impacts us. But also what I mentioned in my opening comments, which is that for every American, beating the virus here at home has got to be our #1 priority. But right behind it has to be to make sure that we beat it abroad too, because it will come back. There have been nations, in fact, New Zealand, not that long ago, that got down to 0 local transmissions of COVID-19, but then through travel had it reintroduced into their communities. And so we have to understand that this is not just something that we are going to be able to deal with here in Dallas or here in North Texas or here in Texas or here in the Southwest or even in the United States. It has to be done around the world. And we're the only country that has the capability to distribute, disseminate, to lead the process of beating this. And so I think that our role is so critical, and the world is looking to us for this, and they always have. The CDC has the best experts in the world, and every time any novel virus, whether it's Ebola or SARS or MERS have emerged, the entire world has always looked to the CDC and looked to the United States for leadership. I'm hoping that we can fill that role. I know we have it in us. We just have to put the investment into it, take it the serious approach to it that it needs, because Texas will not be safe until the world is safe. And that is certainly true on both the public health side and the economic side.
So it's interesting. I often think about this in terms of we're watching the transmission state by state by state, and it just sort of spread across the country. And that's true for country to country to country, nation to nation. So it's absolutely critible.
Well, I remember the first cases, sorry, Carrie, the first cases in Texas were in Houston from travel. And, you know, I remember holding a town hall in Dallas. We had not yet had any cases in Dallas, telling folks that, you know, kids were probably going to have to come home from schools, businesses were probably going to have to work remotely. And I think a lot of people thought that I was being alarmist. But of course, we see that that's not the case now. And that's, you know, travel is such an important part of our economy and also of our culture that just kind of, you know, drives home how important it is that we take care of this.
So there's a huge risk if we don't get this right. And it's obvious the health risk that we have if we don't get this right. But there's also another angle, which is the national security angle. And you know, there were certainly many challenges we were facing prior to, and concerns over turning inward and not being able to address those challenges, and now just made much worse. And what we see is COVID-19 is exacerbating the instability in weak and fragile nations. And that could have some serious repercussions for us back here at home. For example, there's a report out that violent attacks in sub-Saharan Africa have increased by 37% from March to April. That's in 1 month's time. So you, as I mentioned in the introduction, you are a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And so when you think about the national security implications of this pandemic and what that means for the US, and particularly as it spreads to these weak and fragile nations, what are you most worried about?
Well, you're right. There's a direct connection here. It's also, of course, about attention and how much attention even a great power like the United States can give to a certain issue. But the longer term challenge that I see us facing is that inequality always in areas around the world where you have enormous levels of inequality, you see also driving extremism, and extremists take advantage of that both for recruitment and in terms of their arguments against the existing governments and the existing structures in place that allowed that inequality to rise. And so, you know, we see that here at home, of course, but it's much more pronounced around the world. And, you know, I'm also on the Middle East subcommittee and the global terrorism subcommittee. And, you know, we know the direct connection here. And we also know that the world is very distracted right now, and that there are a lot of forces out there that want to take advantage of any let up in terms of attention to advance their agenda, and who will take advantage of some of the economic you know, consequences and the social consequences from this to say, see, we told you so. We told you you couldn't trust the West. We told you you couldn't trust the Americans. We told you you couldn't trust whatever your democratic institution might be if you have that. And so that's the real danger for us in the long term, is that we may not see some of the you know, terrible fruit of this crisis until later, when it comes back to us in terms of, you know, increased numbers. And so we have to keep an eye on it right now. And that's also why it's important that we not back away, even as we have so many resources being poured into helping Americans, rightfully so, 27 million Americans on unemployment. We need to take care of that, you know, 180,000 dead. Obviously, we need to be putting those resources here at home, but we can't pull away from supporting the institutions and the programs that have allowed us around the world to combat inequality and to try to spread our values. Because if the only interaction that you're having with the United States is through a drone flying over your village instead of the school that we built or the food that we provided, then you understand how much easier it is for someone to grow those sentiments towards us. So from the national security perspective, our soft power is just as important as our hard power. And it always has been, but particularly during a pandemic.
So I want to bring on our second special guest and another expert on this, and I believe a pretty good friend of yours, and that's Ambassador Robert Jordan, who was the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and is currently the diplomat in residence and professor at Southern Methodist University. So welcome, Ambassador Jordan. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to turn this national security question to you as well. And you served in a really fragile region of the world when you were in Saudi Arabia, and at a particular time of uncertainty and instability, and that was during the 9/11 attacks. And so you have the experience and the expertise of what it really takes to keep America safe and secure in a world of truly complex threats. So I would love for you to share your insights and elaborate on why it is so important that we support our allies, particularly at a time of the pandemic, and that's from Israel to Jordan and beyond.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And first, let me thank Congressman Allred for being so nice to my SMU students when we visited your offices in February before this pandemic really took hold. They were blown away by the experience, especially your House Foreign Affairs experience. You know, alliances are a messy thing. They're not always smooth running. There are a lot of squabbles, kind of like you see in large extended families sometimes. But Winston Churchill famously said that the only thing worse than fighting with your allies is fighting without them. And I think this is something that came to bear after 9/11. The only time that Article 5 of the NATO Charter has ever been invoked was on behalf of the United States, in support of the United States after 9/11. And we assembled a coalition to go after Al-Qaeda, to go after bin Laden, based on Article 5. And we had in my embassy, in Riyadh, in the air base outside of Riyadh, countless troops from all over the world helping us in this terrible aftermath of this terrible tragedy. The Saudis were very important to us as allies, even though they were staggering from the accusations that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. So you have a stress on the relationship. They're angry that Americans are angry at them. They're angry that we revoked their visas. And at the same time, we desperately needed them to support us in going after Al-Qaeda, in maintaining credibility in the Muslim world, in fighting terrorism. And after a very difficult period, things smoothed out, things started to come around. And I have to give President Bush some credit for this also in his personal relationship with Crown Prince Abdullah. So some of it's personal diplomacy, some of it is common interests, some of it is a common enemy. So fast forward now to what's happening with Israel and the UAE. They're talking about normalizing relations. They're talking about Israel suspending, if not terminating, annexation of portions of the West Bank. This isn't necessarily an alliance right now, but it could have an incipient effect in the neighborhood. What we want with allies is stability. We want them to be reliable. The Turks joined us on behalf of NATO after 9/11, yet at the same time, when we were preparing to invade Iraq in 2003, they backed off and refused to allow us to use their territory to invade the northern part of Iraq. And so alliances sometimes are fragile. Even our longtime ally, Great Britain, became an adversary in 1956 in the Suez Canal crisis. So you sometimes have different interests, different points of view. And as we provide foreign aid and as we provide assistance and exercise the soft power that is so important, I think it's critical that we understand each country also has its own national interests. And we've got to find a way for us to dovetail those interests in serving this common good and in supporting them, even though we don't always agree with every single policy they have.
Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing these insights. It's great to have a real expert join us. But moreover, I want to say thank you for your service to this country and what you've done for all of us. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Gary.
I do want to flip real quick. You brought up the economy a couple of times, and there's clear impact of economic and America's global engagement. And when we look at what's happening with the coronavirus, it has truly upended business as usual for American businesses in Texas and all across the country, particularly to our exporters and traders. And so you mentioned a couple of statistics about the importance of the exporting to Texas. So I want to read a couple of statistics, which is, as you mentioned, exports very important to the state. In fact, Texas is the largest state, exporting state in the union. And your state exported a whopping $330 billion in goods last year. That's astronomical. But I also think it's important to note that 50% of the U.S. exports go to emerging markets, and that's everywhere from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia. And these are the areas of the globe that are really getting devastated by this pandemic. So I have a two-part question for you. And the first part is, how is America's economic future directly tied to the recovery of these emerging markets? And then to follow up to that, how do our efforts in supporting the global economy ultimately put American exporters back in business?
Well, it's a great question. And I'll also just begin by saying that emerging markets for us are also an area of competition with the Chinese and with other powers that are trying to displace us in terms of our importance to those areas. So I see it having multiple, an economic side to it, national security side to it, but also, global leadership again aspect to it. And you mentioned we're the #1 trading state in the country, and that's why I pushed so hard for us to pass USMCA in the Congress. That would not have happened without the Texas delegation, I can tell you that. And because we know how important it is for us, we're by far the #1 trading partner with Mexico of any state in the nation. And so, if they don't recover, if their economies go down, if they are unable to both trade with us and be consumers for us, then that's going to have a disproportionate impact on us. And so we have a very direct interest in their economies staying at least strong enough to get through this crisis and to bring them through it on the public health side so that they can recover. I mean, that is just absolutely critical for us. And, I think that it's something that, requires us to understand, again, to my initial point, that our economic health and our public health are tied together, and that to restore our economic health here and abroad, we've got to beat the virus. I think we will. I think we will be the country that, I'm a supporter of Operation Warp Speed. I know there's some concerns out there in terms of, rushing, but the idea here is that one of the greatest challenges in human history is going to be the manufacturing of this virus, of this vaccine. It may take 6 billion doses of it. That's going to be an enormous, enormous undertaking for us. And so for us to take the leadership role in that and to help Mexico, to help Central America, to help South America, to help Southeast Asia and Africa, that will help us economically too, to help them beat that. And the other thing I'll say, of course, is instability of these governments will have a deep impact on us. And so we have to keep their institutions in place. Some of them were already starting to, develop some stronger institutions, and this hit them at the wrong time. Others, of course, were not in that position and were even more fragile. And so these fragile states, again, to your point that you raised earlier, I mean, there's so many implications when you have a state that's in crisis. It's both a breeding ground for extremism. It's also, of course, you lose that market, you lose that ability to trade with that place. And the ripple effects out into the region also affect the surrounding countries. I mean, look what's happened in Venezuela has done to the countries surrounding it. And that has a big impact on us as well. So, stability and beating this virus and making sure that we keep these trading partners strong enough to get through this, and making sure that we're the ones that do it. And I really want to stress this because the Chinese have been very aggressive before this virus hit with their Belt and Road initiative to try and invest in infrastructure around the world, and now have been very aggressive with their use of PPE, and they will, when the vaccine comes, they will be producing that to try and use that also to deepen their ties with these same emerging nations. And so we've actually been behind the ball I would say, in matching their foreign investment and understanding what that's doing around the globe, and understanding how their aggressiveness in these areas has put their hands in a lot of different pots around the world. And that's not necessarily going to be a militaristic problem. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's a competition of ideas and a competition of economies and a competition of what the global economy will look like. Whose rules will we play by? Will it be the American rules that are based on, protection of intellectual property, protection of trade rights, protection of human rights as well? Or it will be a different model? And we obviously want our model to win out. And I think it is the better model. But in a crisis, it's also an opportunity. And so we have to make sure that we don't lose that opportunity.
Well, we can certainly see just by sheer dollars and the amount of money that China is investing in their Belt Road Initiative of how important it is to them and how important it is to us as well. So we've been talking about how important it is from a national security and economic perspective for America to be leading globally in its impact to Texas. And that it's the smart thing to do. And certainly it is the smart thing to do based off this conversation. But there's also the component of it's the right thing to do, that it's a part of who we are, our humanitarian values, our American values. So instead of posing a question to you, I'm going to pose a question to your constituents, and we're going to run a poll. So I have a question for all of the audience, which is, according to the International Rescue Committee, up to how many people in the world's 34 most conflict-affected fragile states are at risk of contracting COVID-19? You can click on the button from your phone or from your laptop, and just want to see what everybody comes up with. I think, Congressman, you might have given a little bit away when we were talking about the vaccine, but that's it. 1 billion. 1 billion people are at risk. And that is just a staggering and unprecedented number, which goes exactly to your point about the manufacturing and dissemination of the vaccine to address this globally. So we are getting close on time. So I'm going to stop here so your constituents have a chance to talk to you and ask you some questions. So with that, we had some pre-submitted questions come in. And so I'm going to ask Ashok Mago to come on and ask you your question. Ashok, are you there? Ashok, you're on mute. If you could, you might want to unmute. The new phrase of 2020, you're on mute.
Thank you, Congressman. It's always nice to hear from you. You have touched on quite a bit regarding China's aggressiveness and their policy. I completely understand they are trying to replace us and be number one. Instead of USA being number one, that's what their goal is. South China Sea, their aggression at the India's border, their secrecy during COVID-19, pharmaceuticals. I think we should have local production of pharmaceuticals where we don't depend on any country in a time like this. And if we have to, India is one of the largest producer of generic medicines and have great talent. There are few projects which are being done jointly by US and India. We'd like to hear your thoughts, what you think with this global supply chain, moving most of it from China and moving it to the countries who have the same values as we have. Because South China Sea, they are just throwing money at every small country. As Kerry also mentioned, they are setting up everywhere their military bases and all that. So how should we control, and again, 5G?
Yeah.
I hope no country takes their 5G, because it's not only for business, it's basically spying.
So Congressman, what about that? Our global supply chain and 5G?
Yeah. Well, thank you, AK, for your question. Thank you for what you do. And the U.S. India Chamber of Commerce is so important for us here in North Texas. It's true that we can't do this on our own in the United States. We do want to, and I have been a part of a lot of discussions about bringing more of the critical production of some of the reagents that are necessary for not just for testing here, but our pharmaceuticals in general, so that we're not so dependent on overseas markets. But we don't have to bring it all home because we're the United States of America, and we have very deep and lasting and strong relationships with great countries around the world, like India, like in Europe, that we can rely on a global chain and a global supply chain. And so not all of it is going to have to become domestic. There is going to be, I think we're going to have some strategic conversations as a country about what is in our national interest to make sure that we're able to produce here at home. And, we should have activated the Defense Production Act here at home. We should have converted some of our industry to really go after some of the things that we did have shortages on early on. But what can we do to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again, where we are not able to protect our people? But this is an important point. We can't make this into a nationalist race. This can't be US alone, India alone, China alone, Europe alone. If that becomes the case, and if, for example, the nation that first develops the vaccine, if they decide that we're not going to share that technology, not going to share that information, it will only serve to hurt the overall goal that we all have to have of beating this. And so this has to be a global approach. And again, the United States is the only country capable of leading that kind of a coalition. We're the only ones. And we have to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity to show that global leadership, because if we don't, someone else will. Power abhors a vacuum. And we know that the Chinese certainly will move into that area, and they will move into it with a different set of rules, again, to my point earlier, than we would want to see spread around the world. And so I'm confident that we're going to continue to lead this. And I think that with our ingenuity, with our longstanding relationships, that we can and will find a way. But we'll need our allies like India. We'll need our allies, like in Europe, for this challenge, because this is going to be, as I said, one of the largest production challenges in human history. It just is. It's going to require so much effort to get through this, and it's going to take years. This is not something that all of us are hoping that by the end of the year or early next year we have some breakthrough. But that's just the breakthrough in terms of the technology and in terms of the research. That's not the breakthrough in terms of the dissemination, the distribution, and all the things that go along with that. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us. We're going to need all of our allies, and we're going to need this global world order that we've put in place to allow us to spread these things quickly and to do it in a fair way. So we have to avoid nationalism, lean on our allies. Yes, we'll have to make some decisions here at home about our own strategic resources, but it can't devolve into every nation first.
Right. Couldn't agree with you more. So Helen Gettings, the former Texas state representative and the honorary consul of South Africa, has also submitted a question. So Representative Gettings, I will ask you to come on and ask your question.
Yes, Congressman Allred, how are you? My question relates to refugees. As COVID-19 continues to spread, it's making its way into refugees camps around the world, from Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Greece, that kind of thing. And as you well know, many of these refugee camps are cramped, people living in close proximity to one another, and they don't have proper nutritious food. And so it's a breeding ground, or it can be, for COVID-19. My question is, how does our support for displaced people here in America, in the face of the extreme vulnerability of these people in these camps, how does that represent the best of America's moral leadership?
Yeah, well, first of all, Representative Giddings, thank you for all of your leadership for North Texas, for our state. Thank you. I mean, it's just, I'm so glad to see you. You're absolutely right. I see refugee policy. I see how we treat displaced people. I see how we treat people in crisis as a reflection of our values. And traditionally, the United States, on a bipartisan basis, has been the country that has been the most welcoming of refugees and has provided the most support to the institutions and the organizations around the world that protect refugees, abroad. I mean, you don't have to look any further than the actions of the Reagan administration or H.W. Bush or W. Bush. I mean, this is not just a democratic policy in terms of, a partisan thing. This is an American policy that we've always had about opening our shores to refugees, welcoming them when we can, and also supporting institutions and countries and organizations abroad that are taking care of refugees so that they can be hopefully resettled when the time comes. And that is a really critical thing. I'm sorry that we've withdrawn from much of our leadership in this area, and I'm sorry the example that we've set even before COVID-19, that saying that our country is full and we're not going to welcome anybody else in the country. I mean, that's not who we are. Unless you're a Native American, we were all brought here at some point. And my colleague John Lewis, who we obviously just lost, to say that we might have come here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. Well, that boat has been made up of, refugees too, and folks who have fled violence, who fled instability, and who've made our country better because of their experiences of knowing what they don't want to see. And in many cases, their commitment to our democracy and to our institutions has been strengthened because of their experiences. So, I think that this crisis is going to lead to, we already were seeing some of the largest displacements of people in our history outside of a world war because of what was happening in Syria and Venezuela. You can kind of go down the list. There was so much displacement already taking place around the world. But COVID-19 is going to exacerbate all of that. And of course, as you said, the conditions are not safe. And you can see if COVID gets into some of these areas, how quickly it can move through it. So we need to lead with our values first, because what people really follow us for, and why dictators and strongmen throughout history have feared us, has not been our military, it's not been the size of our economy. Those are important parts of it, but it's been our values. They're afraid of our values creeping into their country because it'll get rid of them from their positions of leadership. They're afraid of our values because they know that that's what most people yearn for. And if we lose that, then we don't just lose something that we can easily replace. And I don't think we will. Let me be clear. I don't think we are going to lose that. I think the American people are committed to this. This is the kind of thing that is ingrained in us. So I think we'll get back to it.
Thank you so much for that. So we have another question from Susan Phillips, who's the president of the Asian Chamber of Texas. So Susan, if you'll come on.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you, USGLC, for putting this very important conversation together. And Congressman Allred, thank you so much for your leadership in navigating through this very delicate, vulnerable time of our country. I mean, we need strong leadership like yours. And so we appreciate what you've done and what you continue to do for our community and for the country. So thank you for that. My question is related to partnerships. So U.S. and Texas companies will be critical partners in combating COVID-19 as the private sector's resources, expertise, and technology complement the work being done by governments and multilateral organizations, especially when it comes to producing PPE and developing a vaccine. Now, how do these partnerships leverage the strengths of both the public and private sector and make our efforts to tackle challenges like COVID-19 even more effective? And how can Texas businesses get involved in these efforts?
Yeah, well, thank you, Susan, and thank you for the kind words. And I love your question. I'm a huge fan of public-private partnerships in the infrastructure space, which is something else I've worked on. But in this regard, I think it's really important because there are strengths and weaknesses to both institutions that I think we can balance out when we work in partnership. Private industry, for example, can't take some of the risks that you can when you're doing just publicly funded research because it may be a dry hole. It may not lead anywhere. And that is something that you can't afford to do. But when we subsidize private industries and tell them, take these risks, we will support you, even if you don't, even if that doesn't hit, the next idea might, that's when you have terrific breakthroughs. And I think that's what we're all hoping for on the vaccine search, on the therapeutic search, is that our support of some of these companies that are pursuing this technology and this research, that we allow them to get there faster than they would on their own. And they certainly will get there faster than they would have on their own. We're also already producing and preparing to produce these vaccines, that's part of what Operation Warp Speed is about. That being said, we can never let our guard down in terms of the efficacy of that vaccine, making sure that's fully tested, that no politics come into play, that it's entirely a public health decision reached by experts, that when the time is right, that we will tell the American people, this is what we have and this is what we don't have. Because a lot of the experts I've spoken with have said, don't expect a miracle cure. Expect that especially the first early rounds of the vaccine may just make the virus into a much less serious threat, and may not be something where it's just you take the vaccination and you're totally good, you never have to worry about it again. That's probably not going to be the solution. And I'll say this, here in Texas, we've already seen our private industries really step up and be a big part of us trying to get over this. And I mentioned some of the early days when we were completely out of hand sanitizer here in North Texas, and a bunch of our distilleries switched over their operations to make hand sanitizer. In fact, I still have some in my car. It smells a little bit like a bar when you sanitize your hands. But beyond that, it was really important that we did that. Companies like Toyota here in North Texas were helped create face masks and face shields. And there were so many companies that decided that they were going to use their expertise to try and help with this. There were companies around the country that converted to try and make ventilators when the ventilator shortage looked like it was going to be a real crisis for us. So private industry has been a huge help in this. But as I said, they can fill in some of what we don't have. They have some of the expertise. They have some of the cutting edge technology. They also have some of the folks who have worked in these areas before in past races for vaccines that maybe weren't having the time frame that we have, but they'd already had pursued some of that research. So we balance each other out when we work together in a crisis like this. It can't be something where we're just handing out money and we have no accountability to it or something like that. But it does mean that we allow some of these companies that are really on the cutting edge to pursue what would otherwise be quite risky avenues in the hopes that they will get us through this faster. And I think that's what in the end, that's what it's going to get us there.
So you talk about those American companies that stop what their mission is to help out others, and not just domestically, but internationally. And it really is at the heart of who we are as Americans. And it does give you that hope that we can all pitch in together in partnership with the government and helping to mitigate some of that risk for the company. I can't believe an hour's up already. So I want to pose one last closing question to you, and it is about that hope. We've talked about some risks, and we've talked about what can really happen that's dangerous to our national security, our economy, and everything else. But as I have watched you in Congress, you're an optimist. This is not, you are not the doom and gloom member of Congress. So I want to end on a positive note of what does give you hope as you sit on this committee and you see what's happening all around, not just in America, but around the world. What gives you hope that we're going to defeat this?
Well, I believe in us, and I believe, when I saw the lockdowns, for example, that we had here in North Texas, when we asked folks to stay home and to not go out at all, and you saw how quickly people complied with that, but also the sacrifices that they made to stay in touch with one another. You see grandparents meeting their new grandchildren through windows. You see frontline healthcare workers renting out apartments and renting out hotel rooms because they don't want to go home and expose their family, but they're going to work so hard to save yours. You see businesses, as you mentioned, converting their operations, knowing that they're going to lose money on it, just to do the right thing. I think that when we are honest with the American people, when we're honest with people around the world and tell them, this is what we have to do. These are your marching orders. If you do these things, if you wear a mask, if you socially distance, if you practice as incredible hygiene as you can, then we will beat this virus. I've seen people respond to that. And we've already seen that here in North Texas in recent weeks. Since our statewide mask mandate went in place, we have seen a reduction in the numbers of cases and also in the numbers of hospitalizations. And that's because people are complying with it. And I think that's honestly what the American people want us to do. is for leaders to be honest with them, tell them about the scope of the challenge that they're facing, give them a solution that they can do, that they can practice to try and overcome it, and then they will. I mean, obviously there's always going to be some knuckleheads who aren't compliant, but that's not, those stories get far too much attention when you see the vast majority of people doing everything they can to support their neighbors. And, I'll just end by, saying this. You see the North Texas Food Bank here, which has fed just tens of thousands of families through this crisis. And we understand that they couldn't exist without so much support from our community. And, we are in this together. This virus is one that makes us all our brother's keeper, makes us all our sister's keeper. What happens down the street does impact you. We should have always probably known that, but we certainly see that now. And I think that the American people and the spirit that we have is going to allow us to overcome this, but we have to give them the marching orders. And so to me, that's what this is all about, is that we have to remember who we are, that we're the United States of America, that there's nothing that we've ever faced that we haven't overcome when we put our minds to it. We went from having no idea what we were doing to putting a man on the moon in a matter of years. And that was using less power than I have in my cell phone for computing right now. And so, this is not a challenge that's above us, and it's not something that we cannot overcome, but it's going to take us all working together. And I believe we will. And I've seen that, as bad as our politics have been, this is not a political discussion, but as bad as our politics have been, our people are always so much better, and they really are. They're much bigger, they are seeing much more clearly. I think they're more open-minded, more open-armed. They understand the risks that this poses, and they're taking it very seriously. And that's why I think we're going to start turning this around. But thank you to USGLC and for all the folks who are involved with this, for talking about this, because our global leadership, it really does start at home, but it is really critical that we maintain that. It's not just about doing it to avoid having another nation like China supplant us as a superpower. That's not really what I'm concerned about. It's not a competition. It's the world we want to see. It's the world we want to live in. It's the world I want my 18-month-old son to grow up in. One where you're free to pursue whatever version of your dreams that you want to pursue. One that's free of persecution of any kind. That's sees democracies on the rise. That sees people being empowered. That sees self-governance and the idea of self-governance being reinforced. That is the world that I want to deliver to my son. And that's the world that we all want to be in. It's not a thing about who gets to be called the superpower or who has the biggest this or the biggest that. It's about the values that we all want to see spread, and we're right, and that's the good thing. We're on the right side of history in terms of our belief in democracy, in terms of our belief in the institutions that empower individuals. That's the right path for us to pursue. We just have to do it in a way that makes sure the rest of the world knows who we are and that we stick to our own values. And when we do that, there's nothing that we can't do.
Well, I'll tell you, Congressman, what gives me hope is that there are leaders like you and your colleagues on both sides of the aisle that share that same vision and are really working on these issues. So thank you so much for all that you're doing for your district and for the country at large. So at this, I want to turn it over to my colleague, whom you all know, Troy Williams, the Southwest Outreach Director. Troy.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you, Congressman Allred, for joining us today. Sharing both your time and your insight. Your continued support has been invaluable. And as we continue to tackle a number of global challenges, I can't say it enough how much we appreciate your leadership on these issues. And as a proud constituent of District 32, thank you, sir. Thank you to Ambassador Jordan, Susan, Ashok, the Honorable Helen Giddings, also our Texas Advisory Committee members and Veterans for Smart Power who joined us today. We certainly appreciate your time, your attention to these issues, and are glad that you all joined us in this conversation to really thank Congressman Allred. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your position on these critical issues, how important they are to you, your community, is crucial to moving the needle forward. So please be sure when you have a chance, reach out to your members of Congress. Share the importance of keeping America's global leadership strong. Your voice is important, and it certainly makes all the difference. You received emails from me, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Let's stay connected. Follow us on Twitter for updates and information about our upcoming virtual events. And in case you missed it, this summer, USGLC launched the Next Gen Global Leaders Network to invest in the next generation of leaders who can really inspire communities and their peers on the importance of America's global leadership. So as our trusted partners, we are relying on you to help us in identifying these leaders in your local communities. So if you're interested in nominating a candidate or simply learning more about the program, please let me know. And one final thanks to all of you for joining us today, especially during these difficult times. And until next time, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.